am so delighted to see so many faces joining us today for today's webinar, which I hope will be, on one hand, incredibly fruitful for you all, but also on another hand, will demystify some of the processes of our State Historic Preservation Office and also introduce you to one of our foremost allies in that office. So without further ado, and out of respect for your time, I will go ahead and kick us off today. I am Angela Thorpe, the director of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 5th webinar in the Commission's 9-part webinar series, Growing Our Griots, Strengthening North Carolina's Black Heritage Keepers. During this series, we have been exploring how our state's Black heritage institutions can execute innovative and sustainable work with the insights of a diversity of culture workers from across the state and country, like today's guest, who I will introduce in just a moment. The North Carolina African American Heritage Commission received the American Rescue Plan Humanities Project Support Grant from North Carolina Humanities to execute this series. And you can learn more about North Carolina Humanities online at www.nchumanities.org. Funding for the American Rescue Plan has been provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the American Rescue Plan Act. So just a couple of housekeeping notes. Today, please feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat. It's going to be monitored, and we'll also have space for question and answer at the end of today's presentation. I also want to thank the members of my team who made today's webinar possible: Adrian Nearday, Associate Director; Miranda Clinton, who is a graduate student in NC State's Public History program, and Miranda's work is being funded through this grant. We also want to say a special hello to John Cooper, Dee Pearson, Catalina Lopez, and Winifred Query. They are graduate and undergraduate students at UNC Greensboro, Wake Forest University, Belmont Abbey College, and Winston-Salem State University, respectively, and they are being funded to learn from this webinar series. Finally, today's webinar will be available via recording, so you can return to it and also share it with your friends and colleagues. And as a note, the next webinar in this series will build upon what you have learned today. We will be having a conversation with leaders from the North Carolina State Historic Preservation Office Certified Local Government Program, as well as a representative from a certified local government in Charlotte on demystifying the process for preserving local resources for African American history, again, at the local level. In the meantime, I am thrilled to welcome our presenter for today, Sarah Woodard, who is the Branch Supervisor for the Architectural Survey and National Register Program for the State Historic Preservation Office. Sarah's full bio is available on the Commission's website. Without further ado, Sarah, thank you for joining us and for sharing your knowledge.
Thank you, Angela. I'm really pleased and flattered to be here, and I will jump right in and get started with my presentation. As Angela said, I'm the Branch Supervisor for the National Register and Architectural Survey programs here at the North Carolina State Historic Preservation Office. And I'm going to share with you some information about the National Register program, but I'm going to try to weave some of that information in with some of the specifics that I've seen in that are specific challenges to documenting African American resources through the Register program. And so I'm hoping you'll take away some knowledge about the program and how to access it, but also a little bit of insight into some of the challenges the program presents to African American resources really specifically. And I want to give you a little bit of background about how the program came to be, which of course feeds into some of the other things we'll discuss. So the National Register program was born out of a desire to recognize and celebrate and protect the nation's history by protecting its architecture. And that was really, the flames of that were fanned in the 1960s by urban renewal, which was taking a big toll on the country's cities. Thus, Congress passed the Historic Preservation Act of 1966, and that created a mechanism to protect historic resources from federally funded or federally licensed projects. Basically, the idea is that we shouldn't use tax money to destroy historic buildings. So, how do we know what's historic? To answer that question, to know what you want to protect, the Act also set up the National Register of Historic Places and provided criteria and rules to make the decision between historic little h, meaning this is just old, and historic capital H, meaning, hey, pay attention and take care of this. Another question is who is going to make these evaluations and run these programs? The Act answered that question by setting up state historic preservation offices in every state and territory and created tribal historic preservation offices. So the State Historic Preservation Office, which is where I work, that's in place and has been since the late 1960s. And we have systems of evaluation. We have documentation programs, environmental review protection programs, and restoration programs, as well as the Certified Local Government Program, which helps with local preservation efforts. So, so what is the National Register and how does one get on it? The Register is the nation's list of historically and architecturally important places. The process for listing is time-consuming and rigorous, but it comes with essentially no restrictions for private property owners. Restrictions only come into play if federally funded or licensed projects are having an effect on the historic resource. People who own properties that are individually listed or that contribute to the historic or architectural character of a historic district can opt in for the tax credit program, but that's a different ball of wax and it's entirely optional. So owners can even tear down National Register resources if they want to. Buildings are the most common listing. We also list sites. This is the Tarboro Common. And structures, which can include bridges, but also things like locomotives, including the Tweetsie locomotive. Structures also include sculptures, monuments, boundary markers, statuary, and fountains. And finally, there are districts, which are concentrations of historic resources like a neighborhood, a college campus, an industrial complex, or even something like the archaeological remains of the Dan River navigation system. So how does a resource get listed? In North Carolina, the very first step is getting on the study list. This is sort of a weeding process where a property owner, or in the case of a district, a neighborhood group or advocate, or even a city or town, uses an application form and provides our office with history and photographs of the resource. This is something a private individual can undertake. It doesn't need to be professionally compiled, and our office will help you with an application. The goal of the application is just to give our office, like I said, a little history, some photographs, enough information for us to decide or make a recommendation that we think this is a good candidate for the National Register. So our staff takes a look at the resource, discusses it collectively, and then we make a recommendation to our National Register Advisory Committee, which I'll refer to as the NRAC. The NRAC is a panel of experts. They review study list applications and National Register nominations at meetings that they hold 3 times each year. So we give them recommendations and they approve it or not. And then once a resource is listed on the study list, the owner or interested party can move forward with a National Register nomination. A National Register nomination form is a document that requests key pieces of information about the resource and provides a place for the author to make a case that the building, site, structure, or object is worthy of the designation. The writer does this by describing the resource, providing its history, and then setting that history into what we call a historic context to argue the resource's historic or architectural significance. To be listed on the National Register, a resource needs historic significance and integrity, and we'll define those in just a minute. And it also must be important in at least one of 4 ways, which are called criteria. Criterion A says that a resource can be listed if it's associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. This means that the resource has significance because it is associated with a single event, say like a battle, or it's significant as a good representative of a pattern. This is the Jarvisburg Colored School in Currituck County, and so it's associated with the history of education and Black history in Currituck County. Criterion B is used when the place is important for its association with an important person. It could be a birthplace, but more often it's the place where the important person lived during his or her productive life, or where they worked during his or her productive life. So for an example, an architect's house might be still standing and his or her office. So the nomination is going to be for one of those buildings, and it's going to need to make an argument that the building being nominated is the best architectural resource, the best building to represent that person's productive life. Criterion C is the architecture criterion. The description states that the property embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, meaning that the building embodies a certain style or it's a really good example of a certain type. It can also be represent the work of a master, meaning it's the work of a known architect or builder, or possess high artistic value, meaning that it's high style. It represents a particular style. Also, criterion C can be applied to districts where the individual resources lack individual distinction, but as a whole, they can represent certain aspects of architectural significance. And finally, there's criterion D, which allows for the designation of archaeological resources. Generally, properties owned by or used by religious institutions, moved buildings, birthplaces, or graves, cemeteries, reconstructed buildings, commemorative properties, or resources that are younger than 50 years are not eligible for the National Register. But there are a set of criteria considerations that provide exceptions, and all the resources in these photos have met those exceptions. And this particularly comes into play with African American resources. We find that the last remaining or the best still remaining resource related to a community might be a church or a cemetery, and that will provide a path forward for designating those resources. So significance. I've mentioned significance. Let's look at these 2 houses. Are both of these houses significant? And the answer is yes. They're very different, but they are significant. Both of these houses are listed on the register. Both are in Forsyth County. Evergreen Farm, the one that's a lot plainer and simpler, is actually listed under 3 different criteria. A, for its association with agriculture, B, for its association with an influential farmer, And D, for its the likelihood to yield important information about agriculture modernization. While the Chatham House, the sort of fancier, the bigger house, is listed only under one criterion, C, for its architectural design. So significance comes in all shapes and forms, and sometimes we get distracted by the big and the pretty, and we forget about the significance of the small and the mundane. But I do think the small buildings are getting more and more attention all the time. And so now let's talk about architectural integrity. This is integrity um, related to architecture. It's not a moral or a character judgment or a slight on a building if if we say it doesn't have architectural integrity. Um, but architectural integrity is basically the question of, does the building look like it did when it achieved its significance? So for things where the architecture is important, that's pretty straightforward. Does it look like it did when it was first designed or built? But if its roof has collapsed, or its windows have been replaced, or its siding covered, it can no longer convey its significance. So, for instance, this house now looks like this, so it has lost its architectural integrity, and if there was something important about it, it can no longer convey it. So this drugstore, and sometimes it's not so clear cut. This drugstore was built around 1920 in Kinston, but its period of significance, meaning the window of time during which it was important, is actually 1960 to 1961 because that's when two sit-ins occurred here. So the question of integrity for this building is not, did it look like it did when it was built in 1960, but does it look like it did in 1960 and 61? And the answer is yes, and the sit-ins were significant in Kinston's history, so that allows the building to move forward to the National Register. This is a study listed house. It's not on the register or not on the register yet. But it was built around 1800, but it no longer retains architectural integrity from that first period. Uh, the older log house is buried inside, but its significance and integrity date from the late 19th century from a remodeling, and it's architecturally significant as a late 19th century farmhouse with good integrity, but integrity from that second phase. So we now know a little bit about the technicalities of the register, and I want to go back to the beginning for a moment and back to urban renewal. This is a photograph from an urban renewal project in Asheville. Urban renewal disproportionately affected Black people and poor people, but the criteria to decide what to protect is really best suited to evaluate something like this house instead of this house. So the program has not always been very accessible to Black constituents or very effective in protecting and promoting African American history through the architecture associated with African American history. Today, I think, or I like to think, I hope that that we are taking some steps, some tentative steps and some bigger steps to expand our tent, so to speak, and make our programs more effective in meeting the needs of all our citizens, not just those who are interested in historically white-owned or historically white-oriented resources. So by the late 1990s, when I was in graduate school, we'd already, and when I say we, I sort of mean broadly the whole field, had begun to focus more or learn more about smaller and plainer buildings. And I received pretty good training on thinking about and considering simpler houses, how to recognize them, document them, and sort of recognize their history and their significance, even though they might not be the most eye-catching resources. Mill villages are a good example. And the field had already been really attuned to documenting the antebellum working landscape, meaning the outbuildings and houses for enslaved people, sort of the back of the big house, if you will. And this is a house for enslaved people in Edgecombe County, a very fancy building that matches the larger house. But we were usually placing the white perspective at the center of our evaluation of those resources, and sort of placing the white perspective at the center of our storytelling around those resources. So, for instance, thinking about the main house as the owner's domain and the service area and working areas as the domain of African American people, but not really thinking much about how those two groups interacted, and not giving a lot of consideration of the entirety of the complex of buildings, beyond thinking about it relative to the male white property owner. So in short, we were documenting Black spaces, but through the lens of the white people associated with the resource. And I should note, again, this is kind of a blanket statement. That's not necessarily true for every historian or throughout the entirety of the history of the preservation movement, but just sort of broad brush speaking. So we as a field, we're also pretty good at recognizing the work of Black artisans. This is the work of Thomas Day, but again, often within the context of the white-owned house and the white owner's experience. However, in the last, at least the last 15 years or so, in my experience, and again, other historians might have a different time frame on that, but I certainly have become more aware of the perspectives of people other than the white owners of some of these properties. And I've seen our field evolving to think more inclusively too. Um, and I'll give you a personal example from some of my work. I was researching an 18th century house in Davidson County for one of my last projects before taking this job. And when I reviewed the original owner's will, which I was looking at to learn more about his house, again, very focused on the white owner and the white owner's house, but I came across some references to the people he enslaved. The site had no remaining slave dwellings, but the main house would have also been the working space of the Black people who were enslaved there. And so I added their names to the report, and I explained how one of the people who was noted and recorded had a particularly significant role as caretaker to the white husband and wife in their old ages. And that person would have been very intimately enmeshed in the life that was happening inside the house, which was the resource that was the focus of my work because it's the resource that was still standing. And I'm not saying that to pat myself on the back or anything, but to point out that 20 years ago when I started out, I probably would have made a mental note of this tidbit of information about the people, the white family enslaved, but I would have treated it as a tidbit, and I don't know that I would have included it in the report. So that, of course, tells me that we as a profession have missed um, an untold number of opportunities to tell the complete story of a resource because our focus was really incomplete. Um, so simply broadening that focus and thinking a little bit sounds like a very small step, and it is a small step. It's a small shift in thinking, but it is a shift that seems to be happening throughout our profession, and that's a very good thing. We When we get reports, when we get National Register nominations, we expect by default that if it's an antebellum resource, it is going to include documentation of enslaved people, or if it's a resource after the Civil War, after emancipation, that for example, a county survey is just by default going to include African American resources as well. So we as a field are also shifting our language. In our office, if we received a nomination today that referred to the master owning slaves or used the number of enslaved people to quantify the white family's wealth, we would send it back and ask them to assign responsibility. Say that Mr. Smith enslaved these people, not that Mr. Smith um, owned slaves, but that he actively enslaved people. We would also ask if they had checked the state records or other sources that might give us the names of some of the other people beyond the white family who lived there. Again, very small change, but a change for the better. Most of the historic buildings still standing in North Carolina today actually date from after the Civil War, however. So resources related to Black citizens that aren't antebellum resources, so which often get preserved because someone's drawn to the main house or the big house to preserve that, and they also preserve the other buildings on the property. But most of our resources, Black or white, no matter what, are post-Civil War resources. And the African American resources are much more similar to the white-oriented resources: houses, neighborhoods, churches, commercial buildings, schools, located in urban settings, rural settings, all the way from the mountains to the coast. But there are certain barriers that African American resources face that white resources don't necessarily face. So I see three big problems, three main barriers. I'm sure people could expand on this. We can subdivide it. We could spend many, many days talking about this and talking about why these barriers are there. But I'm going to try and condense it. So the three barriers that I really see in my work are that the resources don't exist. And then the second one is that the National Register remains really focused on architectural integrity. And then the third problem is kind of an issue of trust, which is sort of a soft thing to deal with. But um, again, the first problem I see is that the resources don't exist. We get calls frequently from African American constituents who want to list something on the register, but what they're wanting to list is basically a site. It's um, almost like they'd like to list a memory because the thing is no longer standing. And unfortunately, the register, while it does have an archaeological component, is really focused on the built, still extant environment. Again, we don't really have time to talk about all the different ways our society has abused and ignored Black neighborhoods, Black houses, Black farms, Black farmers. It goes from large-scale urban renewal to gentrification to predatory lending, disproportionately distributed federal aid, all sorts of lending discrimination. But sort of, I'll just sum it up by, we as a society have created some barriers and incentives that have resulted in the destruction of African American related architectural resources through demolition or through neglect or through it's a situation where when those resources were cared for, they were cared for in a way that diminished their architectural integrity, making them ineligible for the National Register. The second barrier that I've seen is the National Register's focus on architectural integrity. So a building needs to look like it did when it became important. However, if the building or the neighborhood has existed under the stressors that have led to a lot of demolition, it may not have been able to retain enough architectural integrity to get to National Register listing. So the Park Service seems to be becoming a little more flexible on that, and I am looking forward to hopefully some really official guidance. But in conversations about single resources, they have indicated that we should be looking more for districts at the whole versus the individual. So, for example, if I look at a neighborhood, the first thing I see is sort of the streetscape. I look down the street, I see the houses lined up and the sidewalk, or I see the overall look of the streetscape, and I say, okay, this looks like a good historic resource. Then I start looking at the individual buildings, and if an individual building has been covered in vinyl siding, but it's got its original windows, it's got its original porch, okay, we can say that still contributes to the character of the district. Um, it's sort of like a mouthful of teeth. A tooth can have a tiny little problem, but it still contributes to the function of the mouth. um, but if we look at a resource, an individual house, and it's got vinyl siding, it's had its windows replaced, and it's had all its porch materials replaced, and it's had its front door replaced, so that what is there is only the shape of the house or shape of the building. Sort of the only thing that's left is its contribution to the streetscape. Then I probably, as a consultant writing a nomination, would call that non-contributing. It does not contribute to the district. We find that in African American neighborhoods, again, for a ton of reasons, the resources are more likely to have undergone too many changes. But if we can have some flexibility from the Park Service in looking at the whole and looking at the streetscape more heavily, I guess, if we can weigh that more than the individual resources, that is a huge, massive shift in thinking that would really improve our capacity to list African American neighborhoods. Um, Again, that's something that's kind of a small, it's splitting hairs, it's down in the weeds, it's really detail oriented, but potentially this could really mark a big positive change in the register. The third thing is trust. You know, look at me, I'm so white, I'm almost translucent. So when an African American person comes to me to share their story, they might not automatically trust that I'm going to care about their story. When people come to our office, regardless of race, they are usually coming because they care about a building. But what they really care about is the history, the story, and the people that go with that building. So when someone comes to me to tell me how important Grandma Ida's farm is, they are trusting me with something that's precious to them. Grandma Ida's farm is precious to them, and they are trusting me to take them seriously and to help them find a way to take care of that story. 95% or more of the resources that come to our office, things that we document, things that you call us about, are not going to be eligible for the register. It is a high bar by design. You can't just put any old thing on there. So most of the resources that come to us aren't going to get listed, but we have other services. And we can do caretaking of the story. So we can make an architectural survey file, we can make a site visit and fully record the building and the history, and we can put it in our files here in the archives building. But that requires a certain amount of trust even to make the phone call to our office. And, can you trust me is a valid question. I just told you that only a few years ago, I might have let your enslaved ancestors go unrecorded when I had the chance to record them. But I absolutely strive to caretake all the history we get. I love old buildings. I love the history they convey. And if you come to me because you love an old building, I will do everything I can to document that building and help you get it recognized in some way. And in this case, when I say I mean my staff, our office, a- every single person that works in our office is here because we love history and we love architecture. Um, so my ardent hope is that we will start to see more Black historians turn to historic preservation. Um, because again, when African American people call our office, they are met with white faces and white people who've had overarchingly positive experiences with the government. And so we, our staff, have to be really cognizant of the fact that someone who's contacting us might not automatically trust us. And so we have to be careful to earn that trust. Um, so my message today is really twofold. Please come to us. Your resource might not be something we can get listed, but we can record it, and there are multiple different places for Black stories and Black buildings at the table of preservation. And then second, I think things are getting better. I think that every single day we are becoming more inclusive and expansive in our thinking and in our consideration. And the Park Service is also doing that as well. So that sort of anticlimactically wraps up my presentation, and I will stop sharing and turn it back over to Angela.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that offering. I really appreciate your awareness and also your honesty. I do want to lean into something that you raised to kick off our questions for today. You talked about alternatives, right? So what are some of the opportunities that people can lean into if their space is not eligible for the National Register? What are some other options?
So the primary one is simple documentation, getting a survey file made, and that also, when we do that, that also puts a pin on our map. We have a map accessible through our website, and you can go on that map and zoom in and out and mess around and look for resources in your area and see what's there. But what that also does is, again, because it marks the map, when, let's say, the Department of Transportation wants to widen a road, they use our map. In fact, they fund our map because they use it so much. They will use that map to see what might be in the path of their project. And if they see a pin there, even if it's not a National Register pin, they're going to say, oh, there's something old, there's something interesting there. Let's take a deeper look at that. And it might not rise to the level of National Register that would really help protect from a real effect or impact from the project, but it does sort of get the building an initial seat at the table, which can be helpful. So I would say documentation is the big one. That also lets people, researchers use our files, other architectural historians use our files, and that just contributes to that body of knowledge. That's our primary offering. And connection to other resources within archives. So straight up archives, if you have something, papers, ephemera that need to go to archives, a, an advocacy project that Angela, your office might be helpful for. It can just be a doorway to open up the rest of archives.
Thanks, Sarah. We also spend a lot of time on the road with your restoration specialists visiting historic Black spaces all over the state, and they are enthusiastic about their work. Can you talk more about what your restoration specialists do?
Sure. So primarily, they are most known for their work with the tax credit project. But again, that requires being on the National Register first. And that's an optional program where property owners can take a tax credit on the restoration or rehabilitation work they do to a building. But the probably the greater bulk of their work is simply talking to owners of historic resources, and historic resources for these purposes is very loosely defined. Basically, if you have an old house, the restoration uh, specialist for your county can come out and take a look and help you develop a plan to rehabilitate it, preserve it, reuse it in some way without damaging the historic character of the building. So they're a great resource. I always, if you're going to do a project on a building, call them. They have a wealth of knowledge and can really help you. And that service is free and it's non-binding. So if you don't like the advice they give, you don't have to pay attention to it.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And sort of on this thread, the last thing that I'll say, and you saw me drop this in the chat, but you can come to the commission as a point of entry. We work very closely with Sarah and her team to strategize around a multitude of opportunities for historic Black spaces across our state. If your space is not eligible for the National Register, it does not mean it is important. We stand behind you in wanting to amplify its critical contribution to your community. And we can explore what are some other things that can happen with that space, right? We might bring down a restoration specialist to take a look and help you make a plan. We might connect you with your certified local government, which you'll learn more about in the next webinar, to explore what are some local opportunities for preservation and designation. We might connect you with our state historical highway marker program, or a program that my team runs, the North Carolina Civil Rights Trail, or we might just sit with you again to explore what are some ways that we can commemorate this space. So there are an abundance of opportunities outside of the National Register, and I think it's important to put that in this space. We find creative ways to work around the barriers that exist. So please, if you have questions, thoughts, comments, if you're interested, if you're a steward or owner of a historically Black space and want to talk with Sarah about how our SHPO might be able to help, please don't be shy. This is an opportunity for connection.
And I'm seeing in the chat that there's a question about SHPO brainstorming ideas for changes to the state landmark program to incentivize designation of Black landmarks. So we don't actually have a state landmark program. It's just that we administer the National Register program. I wish we did have a state landmark program, but right now it's only National Register. And the only incentives we can offer are the tax credit program. And one thing I had thought about when I was on the local commission here in Raleigh is would a local commission put a consultant or someone on retainer to do tax credit applications for preservation projects coming out of specific National Register districts, and really focus that effort on African American National Register districts. So Heather, I know you're in Winston-Salem, so I don't know if that's something the Winston-Salem Commission would consider. And I see comment from Greensboro as well. Greensboro has done some really some interesting African American survey projects that are feeding into National Register nominations.
Thank you, Sarah. I want to call out that we have a question from Kiana in the chat, as well as a hand raised from Miss Jacqueline Ruffin Pittman. So I saw Kiana pop up first, and she asks, for those who are interested in African American historic preservation in a career or academic scope, what literature can folks connect to start learning more about the preservation process? Sarah, what would you suggest? And then I think Adrian and I can build upon what you offer.
Yeah, so there's a pretty old book called The Presence of the Past, and that is sort of the genesis of the preservation movement. It is, as I recall, it's been many years since I've looked at it. It's not particularly inclusive. It's very focused on the start of the movement, which is very focused on George Washington. But that's sort of one, that's kind of a basic text that most people in the field read. I could probably help come up with some kind of bibliography of those types of resources.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll also note that during our conversation, I dropped a link in the chat to the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. If you click on that link, you should be directed to resources, including an abundance of literature. And one of those pieces of literature is something written by Brent Leggs, who runs that program. It is, I would say, like a primer about best practices in African American historic preservation. I'm going to try to find a link to that so that I can drop it in the chat directly. Anything that you would add, Adrian?
It's a good question. I think really engaging in history in general is a great kind of blueprint for starting in the historic preservation realm. I think as you get to know folks in your community who are doing the work, I would recommend engaging with these folks specifically and kind of finding out, okay, what path did you take? What kind of majors and things? I know some folks have public history majors. I know some folks have like a historic preservation certificate program, and places like, I believe UNCG has program related to that. So there are certainly avenues within our state for pursuing careers specifically in historic preservation.
Absolutely. And Kiana, I'm going to DM you. You can reach out to me. If you reach out to me directly, Adrian and I can make connections to you with some of those Black historic preservationists so that you can speak with them one-on-one about their work and possibly be mentored by them. We'd be happy to do that. Jackie, the floor is yours. Please feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Okay. I'm trying to get back to okay.
We can hear you.
Okay. I was trying to type it out. I'm on my phone. We had tried to do a state register for a marker, and we couldn't get enough state information. We found some significant articles from Norfolk, Virginia, from a statewide newspaper, but we couldn't find anything from the Raleigh newspaper for any articles. But there is a significant impact on the history of a building that we're trying to save. So we need some assistance to try to get it on the register. And we were never able to get anyone to help us to get it. It may not be able to get on the register, but we do need like a little pen, because I know through my childhood and my adult years that the DOT and some politicians don't deem this historical building as significant. And so we do need help with trying to preserve the history.
Yep. If you would email me, it's Sarah, SARAH .Woodard, WOODARD at ncdcr.gov, and I can put that in the chat. If you'll email me and let me know the address or location of the building, and we can get you started with our assistance.
Okay, thank you, because we also were trying to get a civil rights marker. We have a marker that's already up, but it's not a state registered marker. It's a community marker that we were able to get up. And thank you. I will email you. Thank you.
All right, great.
Thank you. So I saw a question came through about a neighborhood in Chapel Hill. So it says, we have a historic neighborhood, North Side. They've been told that it may not qualify as a historic district due to a number of changes in the community. Is there a way of possibly obtaining historic designation status now and possibly obtaining financial help for the families to keep their properties?
Sure. So I would recommend that you, I don't know if Northside has gone through the study list process or not, and if it has, how long ago it's been. But I would recommend using the study list process, getting in touch with our office, and we can help you with that. That's a good way to get some feedback. And again, the Park Service hasn't given us official instructions, but we are getting indications from them when we talk to them about districts that they are being more focused on the whole rather than the individual. So if you've been told no in the past, I would encourage you to get back in touch with us and try again. Historic restoration specialists for each county. The restoration specialists have regions, and that information is available on our website. So every county, every restoration specialist has multiple counties that they serve. Oh, I see Christy put that in the put that map in the chat. And a recommendation for the color of law. The color of law is extremely useful, and a lot of the things it addresses feed directly into some of the limitations of the parks of the National Register program, and speak directly to some of the challenges that I talked about today. I would highly recommend that book.
Sarah, I have a question regarding kind of the National Register process. I'm familiar with some of it, obviously having worked with your office. However, I hear sometimes from the onset of, oh, it's expensive to get through the National Register process. What are those costs? What are they associated with? And
Sure.
How does one kind of begin navigating that expense?
Yes. So the National Register there's no application fee or anything like that. The expense comes if you hire a professional consultant to do your nomination. I recommend that anyone do that, but for individual properties, it's not absolutely necessary. You can write your own nomination. We will edit it for you and help you with some of the technical things like mapping as we are able. Depending on how much assistance you need from us, that might make the process pretty slow. But that is something people do and do successfully, is work with us as a layperson to do their nomination. For districts, you really need to hire a consultant, and most often there is some sort of municipal support, either a county or a town financially supporting that effort.
Thank you.
So Angie has placed a question in the chat that I think both, or Sarah, myself, Adrian, and perhaps even Miranda, our intern, can speak to. What is your biggest piece of advice for building trust through community engagement in historic African American communities?
I'll take a stab at that first, because I think my answer is going to be kind of the least informed. So from my perspective, as someone who is trying to earn that trust, I simply try to demonstrate to any constituent, but to Black constituents particularly, that I am genuine and sincere in my enthusiasm about your building or your site or your whatever, your story you're bringing to us. So that's, I try to go in all in and make sure people understand that no, really, I'm pumped up about your resource.
Thanks, Sarah. I would say three things. So one is listening. As public practitioners, this happens in the public history field as well. I'm a public historian. We often go into communities to do, to take, to extract, but we do not listen. So I think that is a critical first step. When you're entering into communities, listen to what people need, listen to what people want, have your ears open. The second thing I think to build upon that is follow through, right? So when you're listening, find ways to follow through on what you say that you can do, that you're going to do, or the promises that you make. And then the third thing is be solutions oriented. This work is challenging work. Telling Black stories and preserving historic Black spaces is not easy work, but having a solutions-oriented mindset, I think, is really important. And that takes work, and sometimes it takes a long time. Sometimes it takes strategy, so it requires a certain level of stick-to-itness, but being willing to follow through and identify a solution that feels good to the need that was stated in the beginning that you listen to, I think is a framework that can help build that trust.
I think along with that, I want to kind of emphasize and underline the time that it might take to build that relationship. You know, a single community conversation, a single, conversation series might not be enough to build that trust in your community. It might take more time than that. And, understanding that there are many reasons historically, presently, why that trust does not exist currently. So, really trying to be understanding of that and, leaning in, and as Angela said, really listening to what folks' needs are is really a first step in starting forward on that process.
I would also like to add open communication. Even if you're speaking along with through phone calls and emails and meetings, just having open communication or consistent feedback into what is the update or process of the work or project that you're doing, even if you can't always get to each other in a timely manner, always leaving a line of communication and progress of what is happening with your story or with your project, so that they know that you're still keeping up with what they deem important.
Thank you so much for that, Miranda. So we are at time, I believe. So we're at 2 o'clock. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. We want to honor your time, but this was an incredibly fruitful conversation. What we'll do to follow up with this conversation, we'll make sure that you have a link to the video for today. If Sarah allows it, we will attach the slides to her presentation. We'll also provide you with Sarah's contact information so that you can be in touch with her directly, as well as contact information for the African American Heritage Commission. I want to remind you that the next webinar will build upon what we learned today. So Christy, if you wanted to unmute and just give us a quick 20 seconds of what you'll be walking folks through, that would be great.
Sure, I would be glad to. I'm going to be joined by Christina Harpst and 2 of her commission members from the Charlotte Historic District Commission, and we're going to be building on what Sarah talked about and talk about protecting African American resources through local designation. So our webinar is going to be focused primarily on at the local level. So we're very much looking forward to that and hope to see you all there.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Please take care. And if you'd like to have more conversations like these, please let us know by email. We'd be happy to put them together for you. Okay. Bye-bye, all.